I was the only one at Grandma's funeral. They said she wouldn't know the difference, but I did. The chapel smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, like her old porch swing in summer. Miles Turner sat alone in the front row, dressed in a navy blazer that hung just a bit too loose across his shoulders. He hadn't worn it since the day he left for college, the morning after his family told him not to come back. Behind him, rows of wooden pews sat empty, silent witnesses to the final chapter of a woman who once held the entire family together. The minister cleared his throat softly, offering a look of quiet sympathy, but said nothing. The funeral director peeked in his face, unreadable, then disappeared again, leaving the door open to the October wind. Miles clenched the old brass key in his pocket, its ridges worn smooth by time and touch. She had slipped it to him on their last visit, barely able to lift her hand. "Wait," she had whispered, breath like smoke. "Wait until they show you who they are, then open it." No one else had come, not his father who once said real men didn't cry, not his mother who perfected silence like an art form, and not Jake, the golden boy, the one who inherited the land, the tractors, the legacy. Instead, just one text from Jake. No one even remembered she was alive. "You're making a scene like always." The message felt colder than the wind. Miles looked toward the back of the chapel. One chair stood slightly askew, the only one he had saved. It was where she used to sit during family gatherings, a quilt always draped over her legs, her hands shelling peas or knitting or simply resting in her lap. The chair remained empty. No one asked about her favorite hymn. No one brought the lemon cookies she always baked. No one even brought flowers. Miles had brought his own lavender from the bush she helped him plant when he was 7, the same one that had nearly died every winter but returned each spring a little smaller, a little wiser. He placed the bundle on the closed casket. The wood was simple, just like she would have wanted. Then he sat down again, back straight, alone. The funeral began. The minister spoke of grace, of rest, of the eternal garden. But Miles wasn't listening. He was tracing his past along the seams of that key in his pocket, feeling its weight, not just of metal, but of everything it represented. The night he was cast out still flickered behind his eyes, the porch light turning off, the lock sliding shut, the suitcase packed in panic. He had been a boy, then barely old enough to vote, and she was the only one who showed up at the bus stop with that same key in one hand and a wooden box in the other. Now she was gone. But in death, as in life, she had left him something no one else could take. Not just a memory, not just a gesture, but a legacy he didn't yet understand. When the service ended, the minister waited for a nod. Miles gave it. The casket was lowered. The wind picked up. No one stayed to throw soil. No one recited a verse except him. He stood by the grave, hands still trembling, and whispered, "She saw me," when no one else did, so I will see her through. And then he turned toward the chapel doors, the key now burning against his chest like a question that finally demanded an answer. If you've ever felt invisible in your own family or held on to a truth that no one else wanted to face, Miles's story might echo in you. Follow Heart Stories for the next chapter. The Turner farm had always smelled like diesel sweat and the sour churn of cow feed. But in one quiet corner, behind the old silo, it smelled of something else entirely. Lavender and soap, that little patch was Miles' world, carved into the edge of a life that never seemed to make space for him. He remembered the first time he planted something not meant for harvest. He was 9. Jake had dared him to run barefoot through the chicken coop, and Miles, ever eager to please, had done it, only to end up scratched, covered in feathers and shame. While his father watched in disappointment, that night he snuck behind the shed and buried a few stolen seeds from a wildflower packet he'd found in the junk drawer. He didn't even know what they were. He just wanted something soft to grow in a world that felt so harsh. His father didn't notice the flowers. Jake trampled over them without a second glance, but his grandmother did. She crouched beside him one day, her knees creaking, and said, "These little things, they've got more courage than most folks I know. They grow anyway." From that moment on, every summer became their secret ritual. While the others fixed fences and tilled fields, Miles and Grandma retreated to the garden. Her garden. She taught him how to blend clay and herbs into calming salves, how to prune back too much growth so beauty could breathe. When his hands shook from trying to hide who he was, hers covered his and stilled them. She would say, "And neither do you." But the world inside the garden always ended when the porch light flicked on. Back inside, the air turned cold with rules. Stop acting like a girl. Don't slouch. Speak like a man. These were his father's favorite phrases. And Jake made it worse. Every misstep became ammunition. The way Miles crossed his legs, the softness in his voice, the books he read instead of farm manuals. Jake called him sissy. So often it stopped sounding like an insult and started sounding like his name. Still Miles tried. He tried to run with the hay bales to match Jake's stride in the barn, to nod along when their father bragged about Turner's strength. But he always felt like a scarecrow dressed in borrowed pride-stiff hollow, barely standing. Then came the storm. At 18, in a rare act of defiance, Miles came out. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't planned. It just spilled out late one night after dinner when his father had asked why he wasn't bringing a girl to the harvest dance. The silence that followed lasted until sunrise. The next morning, his clothes were already packed. No yelling, no slamming doors, just absence. Jake avoided his eyes. His mother passed him a plate at breakfast, but not a word. His father walked out of the room and never came back in. Grandma was the only one who moved. She followed him out as he stepped off the porch, a duffel bag in one hand, and tears held back with clenched teeth. At the bus station, she placed a worn wooden box in his hands. "There's a time to stay soft," she said, brushing his hair from his face. "And there's a time to grow roots of your own." Then she pressed a key into his palm. Old brass bent slightly at the tip. "One day you'll know what this opens." He left that day with no intention of returning, but the key never left his wallet. Years passed. He moved to Nashville, became a barista, then an apprentice in a little soap shop downtown. He learned how to run a business, how to build a life with gentleness, not force. He dated, he failed, he grew. But every now and then, when the world went quiet, he'd run his thumb along the edges of that box, still unopened, still waiting. And now here he was, back on the farm, alone at a funeral, with a key that finally burned with urgency. The sun had set by the time he walked to the old shed behind the garden. The lavender patch was overgrown, strangled by weeds, but alive. He reached into his coat pocket, fingers trembling, and pulled out the wooden box. The latch clicked. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried rosemary, was a letter, and beneath it a rolled deed. But he didn't open them, not yet. Instead, he knelt down, dug his fingers into the dirt, and began clearing the weeds from the lavender she had planted with him so long ago. Each root pulled from the ground and felt like a word unspoken. Each stem he saved felt like a promise not yet broken. She had been the only one who saw his love for beauty as strength, not shame. And now maybe she had left him something more than memories. The next morning, the wind carried the scent of old soil and something faintly sweet. Maybe from the last surviving blossoms in the forgotten lavender patch. Miles stood in front of the family farmhouse, staring at its chipped white paint, warped shutters, and the porch swing that had long since stopped swaying. The key turned with resistance. The door creaked like a memory refusing to die. Dusk greeted him first, then silence, then that overwhelming sense of something about to shift. He hadn't stepped foot inside in a decade, and yet everything was exactly where they'd left it. Like his exile had never mattered. He walked past the living room where he once curled into himself on the floor, praying his father wouldn't find the sketch pad under the couch. Past the kitchen where his mother used to hum while making biscuits, her eyes never meeting his when Jake mocked him. Then he reached the pantry, small tucked behind the stairwell. The lock there matched the old key. Inside, hidden behind faded canning jars and forgotten spice tins, was a fireproof box, the same kind his grandmother used to guard birth certificates and property records. Inside was a folder. On top lay a handwritten note. "To my Miles. If you're reading this, then you stood alone for me as I once did for you. I only hope this helps you stand taller." Underneath, a notarized power of attorney. Mom, a revised land deed. A bank portfolio showing significant investments in organic farming cooperatives. And a flash drive marked only with her initials. He inserted the drive into his laptop back at the motel. The screen flickered, then played. His grandmother sat in her rocking chair, eyes dim but voice steady. "They called you weak, but I watched you walk away instead of becoming cruel. They called you selfish, but I saw you offer gentleness in a house that treated it like disease. They erased you, Miles, but not from me. I kept every letter, every photo you sent. You became a man they couldn't imagine. That's why they'll never understand what I've left you." The video ended with her smiling, holding up the lavender soap he once made her, then fade to black. Miles sat motionless. She hadn't just seen him. She had trusted him enough to transfer everything. Land assets, legacy into his name. Quietly, legally, the Turner family estate, known for generations as cattle and corn, was sitting on untouched acres now valued in the millions. she had refused to sell. Everyone thought it was senility, but in truth, she'd invested silently into a future that mirrored Miles more than anyone else in the family. He didn't have to wait long. Jake's call came that night. His voice was casual, forced. "Hey, I know you're in town. We should talk. Dad's thinking we could do something with the land. Now that you know," the messages followed, first from his mother, then his father, each more transactional than the last. None of them asked about the funeral. None asked if he was okay. Eventually, Jake spelled it out. "It makes sense to divide things evenly. We'll sell split it 3 ways and move on. You agree, right?" Miles didn't reply immediately, and instead he called the town's community hall and booked a space for the weekend. He responded to the family with one line: "I'll meet you all Saturday, but before we talk about land, Grandma had something to say to each of you." The silence on the group thread was deafening. Saturday came gray and wet. The town hall smelled of linoleum and coffee. Miles arrived first, placing 3 sealed envelopes beside a bouquet of dried lavender and a small speaker. They arrived late. Jake looked annoyed, his boots still muddy. Their father looked older, more bitter than broken. Their mother barely made eye contact. Miles stood. "I won't keep you long, but this wasn't just about property. It was about legacy. Grandma didn't want you to leave without hearing her out." He pressed play. Her voice, even recorded, made the room pause. Then he handed each person their letter. Jake's hands trembled as he unfolded his. Inside was an old photo of him at 10 years old, beaming on Grandma's lap, holding a book about wildlife. "You once told me you wanted to be a teacher. Jake, what made you believe profit matters more than people?" Their mother's letter came with songbooks. Scribbled inside were lyrics they wrote together in her youth. "Darlene, you sang when no one listened, but now's the time to speak. Silence protects no one, not even you." Their father's envelope held a pair of worn gardening gloves and a voice recording. "You said Miles wasn't a man, but when I fell ill, he was the only one who stayed. You taught the others to obey. He taught me to trust." The room stayed still, and then Miles placed the final document on the table, a clause in the will. "Any heir wishing to claim their portion must commit to 1 year of participation in the program I've founded, a youth initiative blending organic farming with mentorship for local LGBTQ teens." He looked up. "She and I started it before she passed. It's already registered. The land won't be sold, but you're welcome to be part of it." No one spoke. For once, he didn't flinch at their silence. The following weeks unfolded in wary silence. No angry calls, no lawsuits, just time stretching thin between them all, like the brittle skin of old paint Miles didn't push. He returned to the land, spent his mornings watching fog slip between the stalks of golden grass, and his evenings sorting through Grandma's notebooks, hand-drawn maps, business plans, lists of names of kids, troubled kids, lonely kids. Kids who had once shown up on her porch hoping for work or a sandwich, or just somewhere to sit where no one asked them to explain themselves. She had written a future for them with Miles at the center, but now the question hung in the air. Would the others claim their share? The answer came one Sunday afternoon in the form of a white pickup truck kicking dust across the gravel path. Jake stepped out, not in his usual farm jacket, but in a plain flannel shirt Miles hadn't seen since they were teenagers. He didn't speak, just nodded and walked toward the barn. Inside, the scent of mold and oil mingled with hay. Miles watched as Jake ran his fingers over the wooden beams, eyes distant. "This used to be my favorite place," Jake finally said, "before Dad made me hate it." Miles said nothing. He didn't need to. Jake turned to him, something cracked and unfamiliar in his expression. "I read her letter again. I still don't know how to be the guy she saw in me, but I want to try." So Jake stayed. At first it was quiet, awkward, like living beside an echo of the person who once bullied you in silence. But then came the small things. Jake cleared the lavender field without being asked. He fixed the back gate that had always stuck. He even started showing up to the community center when the first group of kids arrived. Among them was a quiet boy named Eli, barely 13, who had been caught sleeping in the local library's restroom after getting kicked out by his uncle Jake, sat across from him one afternoon. Both of them hunched over a pot of rosemary cuttings. "You ever feel like nothing you say is going to be right?" Eli asked. Jake didn't flinch. He just nodded. "Most of my life, yeah." Their mother came next. She didn't move in. She didn't offer apologies. She brought zucchini bread and left it on the porch. Then a week later, she returned with a faded notebook in hand. Inside were pages filled with Grandma's handwriting. planting schedules, folk remedies, lyrics, scribbled beside sketches of bees and beeswax candles. "I helped her make this," she said softly, "before Jake was born, before everything got complicated." Miles invited her in. She refused, but the week after she came again, this time to help label soap jars. She never spoke of the day he left, never of why she stayed silent, but she sat beside him and wrote down every name of every child in their program carefully into a new ledger. Then there was their father. He did not visit, but one envelope did arrive, no return address, just a scrap of paper inside. "I won't participate, but I won't contest. You win." Miles stared at the handwriting, tight, blunt, familiar. It felt less like surrender and more like a wall being left untouched, crumbling on its own time. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. The program launched that spring. They called it the Turner Ground. The name was Jake's idea. Lavender bloomed along the back fence. Basil and thyme filled the garden beds. A group of 17 showed up that first week, unsure, guarded, but soon laughter returned to the fields. Tentative at first, then bold. There were soap-making classes, story circles, shared meals around fire pits. And one day as summer leaned in, Miles found Jake reading aloud under the pecan tree. A small circle of kids sat around him, eyes wide. He was reading Mary Oliver, the same poems Grandma once read to them when they were too young to understand but old enough to feel. And Miles stood at a distance, sunlight caught in his throat. That night he placed fresh flowers at her grave alone. He didn't cry, he just whispered, "They heard you." 1 year later, the old Turner farm had changed in ways no one could have predicted, and in some ways not at all. The porch still creaked, the rooster still crowed too early, and the barn still leaned slightly to the right when it rained. But in the field behind the house, where dry stalks and silence once ruled, lavender stretched in thick rows like a soft purple. Tied, alive, defiant, and full of purpose, the Turner Ground had become more than a program. It was a rhythm, a refuge. Every corner of the land bore her signature now. Grandma's stubborn, tender vision, carried out by the grandson they once tried to erase. Miles stood at the edge of the garden that morning, trimming stems for the soap class. Bees hovered lazily around the blooms, and the air was rich with warmth and rosemary. A boy named Avery, barely 14, knelt beside him. He was new, fresh from a court-mandated foster home in town. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the wind. "Were you scared?" Miles paused, unsure at first what the boy meant. Avery glanced up. "When they kicked you out, when you had no one." The question hung in the air like a cloud refusing to pass. Miles lowered the shears and sat beside him. "Yes, I was terrified, but my grandma told me something before I left. She said, if people don't give you roots, grow your own." Avery nodded slowly, then said nothing more. By noon, the others had arrived. Jake supervised the compost bins. Their mother sat under the sycamore tree, notebook in lap, teaching a girl how to press herbs between pages. Even the townsfolk, once skeptical, began stopping by to buy soap honey or just walk the garden paths. They never called it a gay farm. Not anymore. Now it was just a place where things grew. That evening, they held a gathering. Something small. No microphones or speeches, just picnic blankets, lemon tea and jars of lavender, candles flickering in the dusk. Miles brought out a photo of Grandma and set it on the table. No frame, just the image of her in a wide straw hat holding a basket of purple blooms and smiling like she already knew how this story would end. Jake raised a toast, "To the one who knew all along." And Miles, he didn't say anything. He just smiled, and for once, it didn't hurt to be seen. As the stars emerged, a girl named Mariah asked if she could read something. She stood up, unfolded a piece of paper, and read aloud a line from Mary Oliver. "Tell me, what is it you plan to do with your one wild and precious life?" Everyone sat still, not because they were afraid, but because the question no longer felt hypothetical. Later that night, after the laughter had faded and the blankets were folded, Miles walked alone through the lavender rows. He could still hear Grandma's voice, faint but certain, not just in memory, but in every petal, every note, every root planted in defiance of silence. He stopped at the stone they'd placed for her, nothing grand, just a simple marker under the oak tree she once sat beneath. It read, "Evelyn Turner." She believed in blooming. Miles placed a sprig of rosemary at its base, whispered, "Thank you," and turned toward the house. The porch light was on, but this time it was lit for him. What would you grow if no one ever told you who you had to be? If this story moved you, subscribe to Heart Stories for more journeys like Miles. where truth takes root and blooms.